What happens when a seasoned television host pushes too far and a member of the royal family reaches their breaking point? Today, we're diving into one of the most explosive daytime television moments ever captured, where years of media tension finally boiled over into an unforgettable confrontation that left everyone speechless. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really triggered this whole situation, because what you're about to hear will shock you. Prince Harry walked onto the Tamron Hall show set with his usual composed demeanor, that familiar, slight smile playing across his face as he settled into the plush interview chair. The studio audience welcomed him with warm applause, and Tamron Hall greeted him with her characteristic enthusiasm, her voice carrying that practiced television warmth that had made her such a trusted name in daytime broadcasting. "Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for being here today," Tamron began, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she leaned forward slightly, establishing that intimate connection she was known for creating with her guests. "I know our viewers are absolutely thrilled to hear from you, especially given everything that's been happening in your life recently." Harry nodded politely, his posture relaxed but alert. "Thank you for having me, Tamron. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and your audience." The opening minutes proceeded exactly as expected. Tamron guided the conversation through familiar territory, asking about Harry's charitable work, his recent projects, and his thoughts on various causes close to his heart. Harry responded with the practiced ease of someone who had given thousands of interviews, his answers thoughtful and measured, occasionally punctuated by that self-deprecating humor that had endeared him to millions around the world. "You've been incredibly vocal about mental health awareness," Tamron continued, her tone remaining supportive and encouraging. "Can you tell us about what inspired you to make this such a central focus of your advocacy work?" Harry's expression grew more serious, his voice taking on the passionate edge that always emerged when he discussed causes he truly cared about. "Mental health affects everyone, regardless of background or circumstances. I've seen firsthand how damaging it can be when people suffer in silence, when they feel they can't reach out for help because of stigma or shame." The conversation flowed naturally, and for nearly 20 minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. The audience was engaged, Harry appeared comfortable, and Tamron was displaying the interviewing skills that had earned her such respect in the industry. But then, something shifted. It started subtly. Tamron's questions began taking on a slightly different tone, becoming more probing, more personal. "Speaking of suffering in silence," she said, her voice still maintaining that professional cadence, but with an underlying edge that hadn't been there before. "There's been a lot of speculation about your relationship with your family, particularly your father and your brother." Harry's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. His shoulders tensed just slightly, and those who knew him well would have recognized the warning signs. But Tamron pressed forward. "Many people feel like you've been quite critical of the institution that raised you, that gave you everything you have today. How do you reconcile your public statements with the fact that the royal family made you who you are?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harry's jaw tightened, and he took a measured breath before responding. "I think there's a difference between being grateful for opportunities and being honest about experiences that were harmful or damaging." But Tamron wasn't satisfied with that response. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial tone that television hosts often used when they sensed they were on the verge of getting something explosive. "But don't you think there's a certain level of ingratitude in publicly airing what many would consider private family matters? After all, millions of people would give anything to have had the privileges you were born into." The shift in Harry's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. His back straightened, his hands gripped the arms of his chair, and his voice took on a steely quality that those familiar with royal protocols would recognize as barely controlled anger. "I'm sorry, but I think you're mischaracterizing my intentions and my experiences," Harry said, his words carefully measured but with an unmistakable warning tone. "Speaking truth about harm isn't ingratitude. It's necessary for healing and growth." The studio audience seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. The comfortable murmur that had been present throughout the interview died away, replaced by an almost palpable tension. Tamron, however, seemed energized by Harry's reaction rather than warned off by it. "But surely you can understand why people might see it differently," she continued, her voice taking on an almost prosecutorial quality. "You've made millions of dollars from books and interviews that essentially throw your family under the bus. At what point does sharing your truth become exploiting your pain for profit?" Harry's face went completely still. The practiced media smile disappeared entirely, replaced by an expression of cold fury that few people had ever seen from him in public. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but absolutely lethal. "I think you need to be very careful about the accusations you're making." The warning was crystal clear. But Tamron Hall had built her career on asking the difficult questions, on pushing her guests to reveal more than they intended. She had interviewed everyone from world leaders to celebrities to ordinary people, with extraordinary stories, and she had developed an instinct for when someone was about to break, when they were on the verge of giving her the kind of television moment that would be talked about for years. Unfortunately for everyone involved, her instincts were about to prove absolutely correct. The silence that followed Harry's warning stretched for what felt like an eternity. The studio cameras continued rolling, capturing every micro-expression, every subtle shift in body language. Production assistants stood frozen at their positions, unsure whether they should intervene or let this train wreck continue to unfold in real time. Tamron Hall, to her credit, had never been one to back down from a challenge. She had spent years building her reputation on fearless journalism, on asking the questions that others wouldn't dare ask. But there was something in Harry's eyes at that moment, something that should have made her reconsider her approach. Instead, she doubled down. "I'm not making accusations, Your Highness," she said, her voice taking on that practiced innocence that skilled interviewers used when they knew they were pushing boundaries. "I'm simply asking questions that I think our viewers deserve to have answered. After all, you put yourself in the public eye by choosing to speak so openly about these private family matters." Harry's hands were now visibly gripping the chair, arms his knuckles white with tension. The public eye is not the same thing as being subjected to character assassination disguised as journalism. The words hit Tamron like a slap, but instead of retreating, she seemed to feed off the confrontation. Her own posture shifted, becoming more aggressive, more combative. Character assassination is a very strong accusation to make against someone who's simply doing their job. "Your job," Harry said, his voice rising slightly for the first time, "is supposed to be conducting interviews, not prosecuting your guests for choices you personally disagree with." The audience was completely silent now, watching this unprecedented exchange with a mixture of fascination and horror. Several people in the front row were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as they witnessed what was clearly becoming a deeply personal confrontation between two strong-willed individuals. Tamron's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like triumph. She had gotten under his skin, had cracked that royal composure that Harry had spent his entire life perfecting. "I think you're being overly sensitive to legitimate questions about your public statements and actions." Overly sensitive. Harry's voice was now unmistakably angry, though he was still fighting to maintain some semblance of control. "You're sitting here questioning my motives, my character, my relationship with my family. And you think I'm being overly sensitive for pushing back against that? I'm questioning the inconsistencies in your public narrative," Tamron shot back, her own professional mask finally slipping to reveal the fierce competitor underneath. "You can't simultaneously claim to want privacy while writing best-selling memoirs about your private life. You can't say you want to protect your family while publicly detailing every perceived slight and grievance." The attack was devastating. In its precision, Tamron had clearly done her homework, had identified what she saw as the central contradiction in Harry's public persona, and she was wielding that insight like a weapon. The studio felt electric with tension, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. Harry's response was swift and brutal. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his anger and frustration. "You're sitting there making judgments about choices you've never had to make, about pressures you've never experienced, about a life you couldn't possibly understand." "Then help me understand," Tamron challenged, leaning forward in her chair with predatory intensity. "Explain to me how someone who claims to value family, loyalty, can spend years publicly criticizing and undermining the very institution that his grandmother devoted her entire life to serving. The mention of his grandmother was clearly a bridge. Too far. Harry's face went from angry to absolutely furious, his composure finally cracking completely. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare bring her into this." But Tamron was in full attack mode now, sensing that she had found Harry's breaking point and determined to push him over it. "She's already in it," she said with calculated cruelty. "Every time you criticize the monarchy, every time you paint the royal family as this toxic, damaging institution, you're criticizing everything she stood for, everything she sacrificed." Her personal happiness to maintain. Harry stood up so abruptly that his chair rolled backward, the sudden movement causing several audience members to gasp audibly. "That is enough," he said, his voice carrying a level of command and authority that reminded everyone present exactly who they were dealing with. "You clearly have no intention of conducting a respectful interview, so this conversation is over." Tamron remained seated, but her voice followed him as he began to unhook his microphone. "Running away when the questions get difficult? Is that how you handle all your problems?" Harry froze mid-motion, his hand still on the microphone clip. The insult was so blatant, so deliberately provocative, that even Tamron's own production team looked shocked. One of the cameras zoomed in on Harry's face, capturing the moment when his legendary self-control finally completely shattered. He turned back to face her, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet, but filled with such rage that it seemed to vibrate through the studio. "You want to know how I handle my problems? I handle them by refusing to sit here and be insulted by someone who mistakes cruelty for journalism and sensationalism for truth. The truth is that you've spent years attacking your own family for the sake of your career and your bank account." Tamron fired back, standing now herself, her voice rising to match his energy. "And when someone finally calls you out on it, you can't handle the scrutiny." The confrontation had now devolved into something that barely resembled a television interview. It was raw, personal, and absolutely explosive. Harry's face was flushed with anger, his breathing rapid and shallow. Tamron stood across from him like a prizefighter who had landed a devastating blow and was waiting to see if her opponent would stay down. "You don't know anything about my family, my motivations, or my life," Harry said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "And you certainly don't have the right to sit in judgment of choices you're too small-minded to comprehend." The personal attack hit its mark. Tamron's face went pale, but her voice remained steady, small-minded. "For asking questions that millions of people want answered. For attacking someone under the guise of journalism, when what you're really doing is trying to humiliate them for your own entertainment," Harry shot back. The word entertainment hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down between two combatants who had moved far beyond the boundaries of professional discourse. Harry's chest was rising and falling rapidly, his face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from being pushed past every reasonable limit. Tamron stood facing him, her own composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of what she had unleashed. Entertainment. Tamron's voice carried a note of genuine offense now, as if Harry had struck at something fundamental about her identity as a journalist. "I've spent my entire career trying to get to the truth, trying to ask the questions that matter. The truth." Harry's laugh was bitter and sharp, cutting through the studio like a blade. "You wouldn't recognize the truth if it walked up and introduced itself. What you're doing isn't journalism, it's a public execution disguised as an interview." The production crew was now in complete chaos. Camera operators were frantically trying to capture every angle of the confrontation, while producers gestured wildly from behind the cameras, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this unprecedented moment continue to unfold. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, many covering their mouths in shock at what they were witnessing. Tamron's voice took on a defensive edge, but she refused to back down. "I'm asking legitimate questions about your public statements and actions. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't have chosen to live your life in the spotlight." "Chosen?" Harry's voice cracked with disbelief and rage. "You think I chose to be born into a family where every breath I take is analyzed and criticized? You think I chose to grow up under a microscope, to have my mother hounded to death by people exactly like you?" The mention of his mother sent a visible shock through everyone present. Tamron's face went white, and for the first time since the confrontation began, She seemed to realize that she had pushed things too far, had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. But Harry wasn't finished. Years of frustration, of feeling misunderstood and misrepresented, came pouring out in a torrent of words that seemed to bypass his brain entirely. You sit there in your comfortable chair, asking your pointed questions, making your snide comments, and you think you're performing some kind of public service. But what you're really doing is perpetuating the same toxic cycle that destroyed my mother and has been destroying my family for decades. Harry, I think we should take a break, Tamron said, her voice suddenly much quieter, finally seeming to understand the magnitude of what was happening. No, Harry said, his voice now carrying a cold finality that made everyone in the studio freeze. We're not taking a break. We're done. Completely done. He ripped the microphone from his shirt, with such force that the wire came partially loose from its pack. The harsh sound of tearing fabric audible throughout the studio. This is exactly the kind of predatory behavior that I refuse to subject myself to anymore. I came here in good faith, expecting to have a conversation, and instead, I walked into an ambush. Tamron made one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Harry, please, I think there's been a misunderstanding. If we could just sit down and ... double quotes, misunderstanding. Harry's voice rose to a level that made several audience members visibly flinch. There's no misunderstanding here. You knew exactly what you were doing. You planned this attack. You waited for your moment, and then you went for the throat, like the vulture you are. The personal attack was devastating. Tamron's face crumpled, as if